everybody. Good afternoon. My name is Christina Rogers. I'm the program manager of the Community Systems Statewide Supports Team at Illinois Action for Children. I want to welcome you to our week of webinars. We have partnered with Tamarack Institute to host a week-long series of webinars to equip and support you in community systems building. This week-long webinar series wouldn't be possible without generous funding from Illinois State Board of Education. We still have space for the remainder of the week of the webinars tomorrow and Friday. So there's still time to register for those if you haven't yet. I would like to now introduce you to Sylvia Chu, who will be your trainer today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am thrilled to be with you. I am also wanting to open just by grounding in acknowledging that I am meeting on Indigenous land, as are we all. And as settlers, we are grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. As settlers, this recognition of the contribution and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment to make the promise and the challenge of truth and reconciliation real in our communities. And I am located today in Caledon, Ontario, which is home to the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Métis peoples. And this is the land in the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit. If you know the Indigenous communities upon whose land you are currently based, I'd encourage you to put that into your chat box, and that'll help us get connected as well. This is me, Sylvia Chu. I am the Consulting Director of Collective Impact at the Tamarack Institute, and I'm also a huge fan of asset-based community development, which is in many ways a practice and a lens that can easily be integrated into many different approaches to community change. And I'm so excited to share my knowledge of it with you today. I do want to acknowledge and thank the sponsors of the series who you see on the page there. The Illinois Action for Children, the Governor's Office of Early Childhood Development, and the Illinois State Board of Education. And for those of you who are just learning about us at Tamarack for the first time, we are a national charity based in Canada, and we have spent 20 plus years really diving deep into this notion of what it takes to make lasting positive community change possible, and have zeroed in on 5 practices, which you'll see in that wheel above you. And for me, ABCD is both a mindset and it's also an approach to community engagement. That's kind of how it fits. And our work in vibrant communities and cities deepening, reducing poverty, cities deepening community are really action learning labs. And we've just added a third one, which I'm really excited about, Communities Building Youth Futures, which is focused on rural and or remote communities, creating new, brighter futures and supports for young people as they transition from school to employment and or life. And I am day 3. I understand you've met with my colleagues Lisa and Liz, and I'm thrilled to be working with you today. As I said, this is asset-based community development. So what I'd love to do is just give you a good grounding in the foundations of ABCD, and then leave a good 15 minutes, if possible, for some Q&A and or insights and ahas from you all. So those are always welcome. So what I'd love to do is also not only give you those examples, but share with you some examples of ABCD in action, and then offer you some tools and resources that if you like this approach and are keen to think about how you might put it into action in your own work, some tools to help facilitate that happening. So if I can call on my colleague Duncan, if possible, I'd like to open us up with a poll just to get a sense from those of you on the line this afternoon. What's your knowledge of ABCD? So are you just learning about it now? Are you familiar with the theory? Have you been part of an initiative that you believe that the principles of asset-based community development, or ABCD, are baked in? And or is this something that you hold close to your heart and apply regularly in your approach to working with communities? So the majority of you About 80% of you are just here today to learn about ABCD or are familiar with the theory but haven't done a lot to apply it to your work. Let me just, can you see those results there on the screen?
Yeah, it looks good, Sylvia.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you, folks. That's really helpful. I'm a huge fan of this work, so I'm keen to sort of share with you a few more examples, and let's dig in. Oops, I'm going backwards for some reason. So really, asset-based community development is just one of many paradigms for how you think about your work with community. So there is the very traditional sort of expert models on the top of this graphic. The first on the left really being the traditional medical model where everything is done to us without us. And then sometimes the other expert model that most of us might be familiar with would be on the right there, the charity model, where everything is done for us based on someone else's assumption of what it is they think we need. The bottom quadrant is what's starting to move us closer to ABCD. The first on the left, the gapper, is really taking a stance that says, I am working alongside community, I'm an ally. So it's really an advocacy stance and often can include some ABCD elements within it. But the absolute sort of far end of the continuum of ABCD is really the citizens and or residents of a community doing for themselves, by themselves. So they have a really strong connected sense of who they are as a community, and they have a practice and a skill at working together to make that happen. So what you'll see is those expert models really begin with a premise or a bias that's rooted in need. It emphasizes, and we talk about this often in many of these approaches, a needs assessment is designed by its very focus to highlight somebody's shortcomings, what gaps need to be filled for them, what deficits they have, and then looks to bring resources in from outside the community to really help address those needs and close those deficits. But the asset-based approach is much more about pausing before we come in from the outside and really taking the time to notice and ask, what are the strengths in this community? What are the resources and assets that already exist here? And how might we begin by building upon those and making people in the community aware of and noticing those assets and strengths as well. So some of the real principles of asset-based community development. This work overall, the notion of asset-based community development, really started percolating in neighborhood work that started in the 1960s, led by a fellow named John McKnight, who taught for many years at Northwestern University in Chicago. And he was actually actively out doing this neighborhood-based work in priority neighborhoods throughout Chicago through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And in fact, he didn't actually start writing a lot of this work up in an academic sense until much later in the 90s. But unlike beginning from a deficit lens, ABCD invites you to acknowledge that everyone has a gift. And that means that each person in the community has something to contribute. And that it's the relationships that exist between the people in a place that actually create that sense of community. And that citizens aren't just recipients of service and or taxpayers, but they really have to be seen as actors in helping to co-create the kind of future that their community wants and needs. And leaders are folks who involve others in helping to build that community that everyone says they want to be part of. There's a principle that really begins with and challenges the notion of apathy. that is often kind of put on as a label to community, and really says, you know, people are good at, generally speaking, and if you give a very clear and concise ask and you make it easy, people always show up. The importance of listening, and that decisions should reflect what the community itself and the people that are participating in the conversations are saying is needed. And that most importantly, it's about asking for ideas, not just presuming you know what's needed and proposing solutions. So it is a bit of a paradigm shift. I do though find it so inspiring, and in fact things like social media can be extremely valuable in helping as an agent to mobilize. Just last winter, I heard of a lovely story. Some young man in Toronto who had lived in a neighborhood with a number of seniors, and he had taken it upon himself to commit that he would clear the snow off the driveways of all the seniors in his neighborhood through the winter. And he was following through as he had committed, and the seniors in the neighborhood really appreciated and valued that. Suddenly there was a freak snowstorm, 10 centimeters of snow get dumped on the city, and suddenly he's overwhelmed. There's no way he has the bandwidth, the capability alone to do everything needed to clear all the driveways in his neighborhood. And yet he knows how desperately the seniors are coming to rely on and appreciate this. He put out a call on Twitter, and he asked for 10 volunteers to come and give him a couple of hours that evening to help honor his commitment to the seniors in his neighborhood. Did you know 100 people showed up? 100 people. So if you make a clean ask and you make it easy for people to contribute, you can be amazed at what's possible. So what we love about asset-based community-led development in general is it creates space for the solutions that are created to reflect local knowledge, local character, and local culture. And that means, as a result, that they're much more likely to be sustainable. They can often result in solutions that are much more creative and innovative than someone from outside the community who might come up with on their own. And often they mobilize in-kind resources and skills and knowledge in ways that no one would have thought might be possible. And ultimately, because there's a strong sense of ownership and caring, there's less vandalism, there's greater maintenance, and more importantly, you're strengthening the relationships that exist within the community. And that becomes particularly important in times of crisis like a flood or a power outage. Neighborhoods where the neighbors know each other, they fare much better because they know how to reach out to each other and they're not afraid to do that. So 3 observations about the practice of ABCD. The first is that communities become healthier and much more resilient when the act of learning how to connect with one another and know each other as neighbors is facilitated. And that citizens acting voluntarily on their own are the richest source of social innovation. And in fact, I would suggest they are the single greatest untapped resource in virtually all community change efforts, because they don't connect. Citizens aren't always connected, first of all, it takes time to sort of build those networks and connections. And that ultimately, the other thing that's important to remember as someone in a caring profession is that you can actually unintentionally undermine the capacity of individuals and families and networks by viewing it as your role to do for the community, as opposed to seeing your role more as a catalyst or a facilitator to support and strengthen, but ultimately start with what the community or what the family or what the individual can do for themselves. So there are typically, in the notion of asset-based community development, 5 typical sets of assets that we look for in a community or in a neighborhood. The first are the individuals. What are the gifts and the knowledge that exist within those individuals that they would be willing to share? Also, associations are those voluntary networks. And those are the ways in which people in the same geographic location begin to understand and appreciate and know how to mobilize each other's gifts. Institutions are the organizations that exist within the community. Place-based assets are things like a park or a bench or green space. They are the physical attributes of a place that you can leverage and take advantage of. And connections are that social capital, the social fabric. And all of those things are important. When I look at these 5 assets, I also think from an evaluator's lens. And if we were going to evaluate a community project, how well do we measure growth in level of connection, the mobilization of a diversity of place-based assets, for example? Those are the most important things. And the work of ABCD is really to help people in a place to both identify and then better connect the assets that they have towards a shared goal. So look at this. This is beautiful. One example of one community group, and it really starts to create a bit of a map for the different associational components or networks that exist that you could tap into. There's hobby and social groups. There's informal, like book clubs and that kind of thing. Women's groups, civic organizations, parent councils, and parent and school associations. There's adult ed groups, men's groups, neighborhood groups, groups for children and youth, groups for older people, folks with disabilities, sports groups, professional associations, religious networks, and church networks, environmental groups. All of these are already organized in some way, and these are examples of people more than willing to contribute energy, time, knowledge to make something good happen. So figuring out how to mobilize those in a place can be really, really powerful. So 3 observations about the work. We've talked about that, I think, already. For me, part of what I found really helpful is to think in terms of the organizational mindset, to really allow ABCD as a practice to flourish. We as employees of organizations need to shift our thinking from automatically assuming that it is our job to do for the community or to do for a particular population, and really ask ourselves, how might I do my work differently so that I am more of a catalyst and facilitator to help connect the neighborhood or connect the individuals to the broader network of the neighborhood? And how can what I offer be a value add? One of the things that I think is really powerful, John McKnight has written extensively about understanding the different tools that exist in community. And what he'll often distinguish is between the institutions or organizations that exist in the community and those associational networks that exist. And one he often says they're both important tools. The institution is very much like a hammer, and those citizen networks are very much like saws. We actually need both, but we also, when we bring them together to work together, really need to know and understand the unique strengths and limitations of each. And it's really important that if they're meeting around the same table, that the 2 groups actually know and understand how each one is different as well. So, he'll talk about in institutions, they're very reliable and they have high quality control. They produce goods and services. They talk about having clients and consumers, and they do tend to focus on meeting particular needs. Whereas networks of citizens, friends, they operate by consent. They provide caring. They focus on citizenry and they focus on capacity. The worst thing you can do when you bring the 2 together is, if the institutional folks start thinking in terms of the citizen networks as an extension of staff, and then being frustrated that they're not as disciplined and controlled or whatever. Similarly, organizational networks can be really critical and assume that an institution can be as fluid and flexible in helping out a neighbor as they are. And the truth is that they're not. So really it's about how do we get these two very important tools or resources in a community to learn to dance well together. There are certain things, if my dad got sick tomorrow and we needed to get help into the home, for sure, having a home care agency be able to come in and guarantee reliably that someone is going to show up Monday to Friday or Monday through Sunday for 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours a night, we need that reliability and that knowledge and that skill. But at the same time, the neighbors who drop in and bring a meal, the neighbors who pop in just to say hi, the neighbors who check in on my mom and help out with the gardening and that kind of stuff, they are also important, and they can adapt and shift and change on a dime in a way that the institutions can't. So that's a really important distinction. So let me pause there for a second and ask if you see or have any questions about the theory of ABCD to start.
Thanks, Sylvia. Yeah, we had one question come through so far, and if anyone else has any others, feel free to put them in the Q&A panel or just type them in the chat, and we'd love to hear it. It's a question about differences in perspective where perhaps from a funder perspective, a specific part of a community might not be seen as an asset, but from the perspective of a community member or a citizen, they view, for example, the closeness within their neighborhood as an asset. How do you reconcile the differences of perspective?
I think I don't know that it's about reconciling the differences. I really wonder if it's about acknowledging that there's legitimacy to both perspectives. I know that doing an asset-based community development project in 2 inner city neighborhoods in Baltimore, I learned a lot about, one of the things we did when we got the neighbors together was to ask a question about what gifts or talents people had. And what was really shocking to me, I shouldn't have been surprised actually, was this was a neighborhood where they were so used to service providers coming in and doing needs assessments. For the longest time, they were absolutely silent. And they actually couldn't verbalize what they saw as their strengths and their gifts. And then all of a sudden, one woman stood up and called out her neighbor and said, "Are you kidding? You're the one that everyone goes to when they have a sewing project that they can't figure out." And the woman was kind of stunned, and she said, "Yeah, you're right." And then she called out someone else, and and they all talked about what they looked to each other for. And so there was a real learning for me that sometimes we are so used to not focusing on our gifts and our assets that we can struggle, right? We can struggle with being able to name them. So I think there is truth and a funder lens that looks at, demographics and social indicators and says this is a community in need, and there's legitimacy to that. But it needs to coexist with not seeing these people as pitiful and or less than, but that they actually, the way you choose to engage with that community can lift them up and help strengthen and connect the strengths that they help them to notice and connect the strengths that do exist, and then explore what else they might need and want. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, and it kind of leads into our next question, the last one we have for now. Within communities that have been approached for things like needs assessments, like you've mentioned time and time again, but never seen the results of those engagements, how would you suggest going about collecting assets or itemizing assets within those communities that might be hesitant to engage with another group?
Couple of thoughts. The first thought might be who in the community is already seen as a leader. If you were to knock on the doors of 6 people and say, who is it in this community that people look to when something has to get done, or when something has to happen, or when there's a problem that's bubbling? And if you ask enough times, you'll start hearing 3 or 4 or 5 names come up typically. And then you ask those folks. You talk about things like how, what are the things you're hearing and seeing, or what are the gifts and whatever that exist in the community, how they've been mobilized. And if they don't know, maybe it's working in partnership and alongside them, because they have the trust of the community. And you can't underestimate how critical and how important it is in a community that has been overly studied and overly engaged and by outsiders. How suspicious, like it's almost like if you're the next outsider, you're paying for all the sins of the folks that came before you, who took what they needed in terms of information and knowledge from the community and walked away. That's one thing, you can look at where people are already meeting, like at a farmer's market, like, I don't know what a flea market or whatever, and just put up a stand and just ask, what are the gifts and talents that you have that you would be willing to share, and just notice what shows up. You can do those kinds of things. In fact, in the UK somewhere, I've heard of a couple of GP practices, family physician practices, where they were getting lots and lots of folks in for visits. And the primary reason these folks were coming in is they were actually lonely and disconnected. Many of them were seniors. And so one of the things that they did was they put in the waiting room a flip chart sheet that said, these are, that there's a number of seniors in the community and these are their interests, and, connect in if you have similar interests and I'll help facilitate you. Connecting with each other, and that eliminated a lot of these unnecessary visits. So it's about making it tangible and easy, I think, as easy and simple as you can, and you can start small.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sylvia. That's really helpful.
Okay, so a tool. Let's talk about how you might go about this, and always useful, I think, to start by practicing on yourselves and your own team. And we at Tamarack often use this fabulous tool called the Personal Asset Inventory. And what you do is you give everyone on the team or at the meeting 6 to 10 Post-it notes, and you ask people to put their names on those Post-its. And then on each Post-it note with their name on it, you want them to write one skill or one ability that they have that they would be willing to share and contribute to the collective work of your group. And it's funny, typically the first 4 or so are great and flow fairly easily. And the really rich ones come later, but it's helpful to give people more than 4, right? And then what you can do is cluster them and invite people to look with you about what are you seeing as the strengths that we have collectively, and where are the gaps is another opportunity, or where are there skills that you see up on this board that you might like to learn is another way to go at it as well. And so then what you start to see is, if you're going to tackle a big community project together, you individually don't have to know it all, but you'll know how to effectively tap into other people based on the skills and the gifts that they themselves have shared. Same is true for community. Creating opportunities for the community to match what skills people have and skills that people would like to learn is huge, and requires very little in terms of ongoing support once things are connected. So there you go. So what we've done here is we've shown you an example where people have said, on the one quadrant, here are skills and passions that I can contribute. And then they've also kind of separated them out. Passions are things that I'm interested in. Skills are things that I know how to do. And then you can share those, and then you can see commonalities, you can see connections. On a staff team, doing a distinction between skills I have and skills I would like to learn is a nuance of this, but then it also allows people to be buddied up with people who are quite skilled in the skills that they want to develop next, and really help facilitate that. I know often when we engage citizens in community-based projects, we don't often do this kind of skill inventory piece. And so as a result, we're not leveraging the gifts that they bring in ways that are easy for them. And when we have this kind of skill matrix made visible, it becomes really easy to harness that. And also to create safe spaces for people to grow and expand the skills and assets that they have. So I'm a huge fan of that as an approach. So again, I mean, I don't know if this is a practice that you folks have used, and or if you have any thoughts and ideas about how you'd like to use it, that would be great to hear. I saw someone put in the chat box just now that it would be a great icebreaker tool. And I absolutely agree. It would be awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. We had a question about what the boundaries are of a passion or skill, because within kind of a professional context, you can imagine that there might be some pressure to keep it within the bounds of what might, reasonably seen as a work skill or a work passion. Do you have any examples of skills or passions that would be helpful within a community context that might not otherwise be considered?
Oh, yeah. I have an absolutely great example. In the city of Hamilton, there were a number of poor neighborhoods, and one of the groups in one of these poor neighborhoods started something called the property elves. And the property elves were people who had skill in doing things like painting or plumbing or basic electrical repairs or carpentry. And what they would do is they would go around to other homes in the neighborhood, and they would work together to take on small repairs and upgrades of the homes, because many of the homeowners couldn't afford to do those. And then over time, what they started to do was encourage and invite other neighbors who were interested in learning how to do some of this stuff for themselves to come along and help out on their weekly or monthly kind of trips around the neighborhood. And that was amazing. And the one woman that was telling the story was saying she actually was a single mom who was really struggling and intimidated. At first kind of standoffish about this, but then became so excited and discovered that home renovation stuff became a real passion, and actually ended up going back to school to learn about it. But she laughed because she said there was some community meetup between their neighborhood and the neighborhood right next door to them. And unbeknownst to them, the property elves of the neighborhood, the other neighborhood had a similar group, and they called themselves the Property Angels. And so what was really cool was that they discovered between and amongst them, they had different tools and different levels of knowledge. And so then from time to time, they would also call out each other when they needed. But there's a perfect example. Doesn't require any kind of facilitation or support. It was just a group of people who started it on their own. And increasingly, I'm seeing municipalities experiment with small micro grants, which they're willing to give out $500 to $1,000 to an individual or a pair of individuals who want to take on a community project. And they often will require an articulation of the in-kind contribution that the neighbors are going to make. And so that's been used to create backyard skating rinks that are open to the entire neighborhood. It's been used to do photo exhibits. It's been used to do community dinner parties, a whole range of different things. So yeah, I think there's lots and lots of beauty and capability in communities that we just haven't tapped because we haven't quite figured out how.
Thanks, Sylvia. We have just one quick question. We had someone reach out regarding kind of the sticky note example. Do you have any advice on how to do that within the context of COVID or in an online space?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is that we at Tamarack have been playing a lot with this program called Mural, that is a virtual sticky note program that allows you to do this in a virtual space. Those of you who are more comfortable in Google, Google has, along with Google Docs has a new feature called Jamboard, and it does something very similar as well that allows you to create a virtual post-it note tool, and you just sort of do it as a screen share during a Zoom meeting, and everyone can then start to see the Zoom platform start to come together. So those are just two that come to mind for me. Okay, so I have a couple more minutes left. And what I would love to do is just share with you one example, and I totally love this example. So this was an example where we partnered at Tamarack with folks from York region, which is just north of the Toronto area. And the York region has more than 200 supportive housing buildings for folks on fixed income. And they were worried and concerned about relationships in these buildings, and picked one building that they wanted to work with us on as a bit of an experiment to better connect neighbors to each other. And we used an ABCD lens to do this. Now, the thing that's really interesting is this is the building. It's a fairly new building. And they chose it because it had the highest ratio of resident complaints, and the lowest turnout at tenant management meetings. So double whammy. No one was showing up at the formal meetings, and it was the source of tremendous complaint. So that was the task. What we did, we pitched the idea for the project. A local leader met with myself and other folks at Tamarack, and we sort of clarified the approach that we wanted to take. And what she set out, Erin J was the woman who was kind of leading it on the ground. She decided that she wanted to engage at least 80% of tenants in the building in some way, in either a facilitated conversation or a one-on-one conversation or surveys. She was just a dynamo. So we hosted 4 community conversations, and these really talked about, what does community mean to you? What are the gifts and assets that you have and that you know of in the community? What are some of the challenges of being in community? What hopes do you have? And what do you want this building to look like within 10 years? And so there are some of the ideas that we actually did synthesize and bring back to the community. And it was really nice because people didn't realize the extent to which others in the building had many of the same concerns. And then that gave them opportunities to then focus in and decide what it was that they were able to do together and what they wanted to do. And this is where one of the greatest gifts of the asset-based community development approach is that they say, when we're planning to do work in community, before we dive into action, when we've got these ideas kind of all mapped out, before we start moving into action, we divide the ideas into one of 3 buckets. The first bucket is, what can the residents do? What can they do for themselves? Now that they know that there's a number of them that want the same thing, what might they want to get together and figure out? The second is, what are the things that the residents in the community want that they have some of the ability to make happen, but they're going to need help from outside. So if we wanted to fix up our local park, for example, we may have 80% of what we need, but we may need the city to grant a waiver in terms of the liability insurance we would need. And then the last bucket is the ideas that people really care about, but if we honestly assess, we actually amongst us have very little power or ability to influence that change directly. In which case, that becomes maybe a shared policy or advocacy agenda. But taking the time to frame it out this way reminds residents that they actually have an ability and a capability to make happen a lot of what it is that they say that they want. And we have to kind of train folks to not necessarily feel like they need to have permission to do that. So what happened within the first 4 months, what we saw was the residents were thrilled to actually have a voice. People who met at community conversations then started greeting each other in the hallways. One of the things that I thought was fantastic was they discovered that a number of them were retired chefs. And so they had a common room. And one of the things that they proactively started to do, even though it was a low income building, was they started to hold a Friday morning breakfast where the two chefs would get together with anyone who wanted to volunteer, and they'd make breakfast for everybody and anybody in the building. And it was pay what you can. And then over time, that money, they had enough left over after their costs to actually donate $500 on behalf of the building to the local youth shelter. And they just felt so proud of themselves as not just, low income themselves, but as people that were able to contribute to the betterment of their own community. And in fact, that pattern then got to the point where at Thanksgiving, spontaneously, the residents put signs up in the building saying, anybody who's alone for Thanksgiving, come on out. We're going to do a Thanksgiving potluck. And the two chefs donated some grocery gift cards that they'd been given to do the turkeys. And then everybody else bought the fixings. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. So what was really interesting is at the start of the project, we surveyed folks around these three questions. How friendly do you feel people are in the building? How aware are you of the different experiences and opinions of people in the building? And how interested are you in working together to make the folks in the building more connected? And you can see the results right there. Before and after the conversation, just having that opportunity to connect made a huge difference and was a catalyst that started a whole bunch of positive things happening. The other thing that was really interesting is that they formed a communications group to welcome new people and orient them to the building. One of the common concerns around accessibility, what they did was they connected with the municipal, there was a municipal accessibility committee, and they designated residents. And they actually got a big blow up of their neighborhood, and they circled the buildings that were inaccessible that the people felt were the highest priority to make accessible. From the housing management building or management corporation itself, they reduced the number of call times in units. They reduced the number of neighbor to neighbor complaints. They saw empowered residents who were willing to take action and growing trust between residents and management of the building. So overall, they saw it as a tremendous success as well. So there you go. There's some question there. And now I can sort of pause on that and wonder if there's any comments or questions about that kind of work as well.
Thanks, everyone. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A panel or submit any comments you have within the chat box. Sylvia, I had a couple questions just about ownership over this work. If you have any thoughts or comments or stories about who in these different contexts was kind of the leader of the initiative or backbone. Is it always an external person coming in to kind of plug into the community, or are there examples of kind of internal efforts to gather assets?
There certainly are internal, but the ones that what I see the most of, frankly, is many of these efforts can be municipally driven. That I think one of the things that we didn't talk about is that we used to, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, had different mechanisms by which community was better able to connect to itself. Churches come to mind, service clubs come to mind, parent-teacher networks come to mind, school networks come to mind. And I think what's happened as more and more families rely on two incomes, as participation in a faith community or in a service club has declined, people's commutes and whatever kind of impact that kind of stuff, that figuring out how to plug in and contribute to your community and get connected can be a bit of a challenge. And so there have been some really interesting experiments around that. the open table group, and it's not the food delivery app, but there was a really inspiring example that I heard about there that's been adopted by chambers of commerce. It's been adopted by faith community networks as well. They identify an issue of concern in the community, and the story I had heard was in a Florida community, the number one issue the community itself identified was the incarceration of young Black men. And so what they did was they hosted a multi-faith dinner with a number of different church congregations attending together. And they had pre-identified 10 young men who saw themselves as a risk and wanted a different trajectory. And over the course of the dinner, what they did was asked for 10 volunteers to come forward for each of the men who had come to the evening. So each of the 10 men left that night with a table of 10 volunteers who had committed to be in relationship with that young man over the course of at least a year, like checking in monthly. And really what the ask is that you open your social network to this young man. So you mentor, you get to know him, you create a relationship over time. And one of the things that you're being asked to do is, you know, if someone is growing up in poverty, for example, it's often not just economic poverty, it's also poverty of relationship, or they need different networks to tap into and they don't know how to do it. So it would be things like, you know, if he thinks he might be interested in being a plumber because he hasn't really landed on a career path, and your brother-in-law's a plumber, can you pick up the phone and call your brother-in-law and ask if you can meet with this guy and if he can shadow you for a couple of days? You know, it's that kind of thing. And it's been really, really powerful, that informal connecting network, and making sure that new folks that want to make a change are supported by community in creating those networks and relationships to enable that to happen. So it's a value add, right?
Yeah, that's really inspiring.
Yeah.
And I laughed because I did get hungry when you used the words open table just by association. We have one last question before we move on. So we've had examples of the ABCD work at the scale of a community and then within York region. Is it possible to do this work at a larger scale, or does it lose its specifics if it goes past the scale of, say, a region?
You know what's really interesting about that? I think that's a fantastic question. And it reminds me, because I just wrote a new paper where I was looking precisely at collective impact, which is a disciplined form of multi-sector collaboration, and how effective is it as an approach at different scales, at the neighborhood scale, at the community-wide or regional scale, and then at a national scale. What I will say is that this is very relational. So what you could have, and what we're seeing in a lot of municipalities, for example, is neighborhood focused initiatives in multiple neighborhoods. And so they may start with 10 target neighborhoods, build up and support them, and then grow that out to encompass more and more neighborhoods throughout the community. Because I do think there's a lot to be said for the power of relationship. And relationships between and amongst neighborhoods. But then sometimes, you know, what the municipality can do then is a celebration of neighborhoods, where different neighborhood leaders get together and meet and learn from and inspire each other. And I think that one's really fascinating. The one that I've also really recently discovered and I'm quite excited about and curious to know more is out of the UK. There is a project called Big Local, and one of their largest funders pledged something like £1 million, which is like $2 million, I think, per neighborhood to 150 different neighborhoods throughout the UK that were sort of not the poorest of the poor, but they were the ones that were like a step up. So they never quite were poor enough to get the benefits of a lot of targeted granting dollars. But what's fabulous about the approach was all they required was citizen leadership. The leaders, the community leaders that came forward in these geographies, they chose the path. they chose what the community wanted to invest in and how the money ought to be spent. And it's the long-term, like I think 5-year commitment that they've made in each one of these communities. And I think that that's another really important thing to consider, that this work is really powerful, but it doesn't necessarily happen quickly. It doesn't always happen on a funder or an agency's timeline. And what it looks like can vary hugely from one community to another. And so it's messy in that sense, but way more sustainable because you're building the capacity of the neighbors and the community to do for itself. So there you go.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. I think that's all of our questions for now.
Well, what I would love to do as a way to kind of wrap us up from this is ask folks, if you could, take one moment and in the chat box type in a word or a phrase about what's a takeaway that you're leaving this session with. What's coming up for you? Or what ideas you have might be another way to play with it. What ideas do you have for applying this framework?
Wonderful. Sylvia, a couple of things coming in from the chat here. Just the focus on assets as opposed to needs, I think is a really liberating perspective, right? That's probably one of the biggest perspective shifts of this approach. From Missy, starting small. From Anne, a great way to empower communities. Trisha, love the personal asset inventory. Impactful. ABCD is wonderful and can't wait to find ways to use it in our community. From Britain, the power for communities and focusing on assets versus needs. So I find that one part is especially liberating.
Yeah, and I've started this new practice for myself about, it's actually about probably focusing on assets and needs, because I think the needs are real. So I wouldn't want to see us only focus on assets and then disregard the needs, but I think it's about adding the assets very intentionally back in. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have a few people that have been converted to either Mural or Google Jamboards as well as a tool. So I think that's going to be very helpful as well.
Yeah, I think that's our big challenge, right? How do we continue to engage each other and with each other when we can't actually there are different apps to help people in a particular neighborhood find one another. And they often start with, does anyone know a good plumber, or does anyone have a drill? And then often can progress beyond that to efforts and interest amongst neighbors to want to connect with each other. Another great story out of Montreal, one particular neighborhood, a woman started an initiative that she called 21 Doors. And within her neighborhood, it was a commitment once a week to have a drop-in cocktail hour from 5 to 7. Everyone promptly arrives by 5 and they leave by 7, no later. And it's anyone who wants to show up in the neighborhood shows up whenever they can. And, you know, sometimes 3 people show up, but they get to know each other. And then, you know, as word traveled, people were showing up all the time. And it was about connecting people to each other. And that's all.
That's great. Thanks, Sylvia. We're just coming up on time. I just had a few quick announcements before I pitched it back to you for any kind of closing remarks. The first is that there is still space in the rest of the webinars in this series, tomorrow with my colleague Liz Weaver and Friday with my colleague Pamela on evaluation. So I've just put a link into the chat. If you aren't yet registered for those, I encourage you to do so. The second is that we really value your feedback, and we have a short survey that'll pop up as you leave this webinar presentation. And we'd really appreciate if you could take the 30 or 60 seconds it takes just to fill that out and let us know how we're doing, because we're always looking to improve our webinar offerings. So we greatly appreciate any feedback you can provide. I think that's all. So back to you, Sylvia.
just want to say a great big thank you to all of you for coming, for sharing your questions and your curiosity and your feedback. And just also wanted to give a big shout out that my colleague Liz Weaver and I, both on November 24th and December 10th, are debuting a half-day virtual workshop on Collective Impact 3.0 and how to create a movement for change. So if that's something you're interested in, the link's at the bottom, and we'd love to have you join us there as well. And I think that's everything. So do we now flip it over to you, Grace, and or Christina, to wrap us up, or are we good?
I think that's all, Sylvia. So yeah, thanks everyone for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Bye, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone.